Hello, my name is Marshall Pontrelli, and I'm a PhD candidate at Tufts University in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department's Geohazards Research Group, under advisor Dr. Laurie Bays. This presentation is titled Soil Amplification in Glaciated Terrain and is USGS Award number G20 AP 00040. Working on this project with us are Jeremy Salerno, a geophysicist at ARA, and Dr. John Ebel of Boston College. In this presentation, we will begin by looking at the distribution of site classes in New England, derived from the slope-based VS30 map developed in Walden Al in 2007. Using this map, we'll introduce the 5 subregions in this study. We'll then discuss how we developed a geology-based site classification map using state geology maps, and point out that unlike the slope-based map, state geologists have several site class E soil types. Thus, the geology-based regional site class map has areas with site class E soils, whereas the slope-based classification does not. We'll then present the FNOT database that we have developed in this research and overlay it onto the geology-based site classification, noting that at a high level, the subregions tend to be where we find low frequencies. With this high-level observation, we'll zoom into the subregions and discuss each of their specific attributes using the geology-based site classes in the FNOT measurements. Finally, we'll discuss and conclude the findings, and there will be time for questions at the end. We begin with the Walden Allen slope-based VS30 map of 2007, clipped to our area of interest, the New England region. Using the NEHRP site classification table on the top right, we converted velocity estimates to site classifications. The result shows that in this model, roughly half of New England is classified as Site B, a third is classified Site C, and a sixth as Site D, roughly. We will discuss that many localized areas in New England may require more conservative classification, but this model still identifies the 5 subregions we studied in greater depth in this research. Those regions are 1, the Boston Basin containing the Boston blue clay and containing artificial fill, which was used to create land as the city developed. 2, the Connecticut River Valley containing floodplain alluvium and glacial lake deposits, which is bounded by faulting and interrupted by rocky hills. 3, Cape Cod, which is a deposit of deep sand and coarse sediments, unbounded by topography, and generally consistent in soil properties over wide areas. 4, the Champlain sea sediments in western Vermont, another marine clay deposit of the last glaciation period. And 5, the Maine coast subregion containing the Presumpscot Formation, another marine clay deposit. With an understanding of the broad region from the slope-based map and the identification of our 5 subregions, we now turn to a geology-based NEHRP site classification map that we developed with the help of the New England state geologists. In 2011, the group got together and each developed tables, similar to the one you see on the top right, that converted their most up-to-date surficial geology map to seismic site classifications. Using the geologic classifications, there is more site class B area and less site class C and D area than in the slope-based map. There is also an added A and E category from rock and very soft layers, respectively. The E classification is the most significant for this study, as many of the soil classifications from state geologists in our subregions are classified as site class E. Please note that the Boston Basin, Connecticut River Valley, Maine coast, and Champlain sea sediments all have significant areas of site class E, and that the Cape is almost entirely site class D. We will focus on the geology-based site classification for the rest of this presentation, as it is more conservative than the slope-based classification. We now have a geology-based site classification. We've compared it to a slope-based classification, and we'll now compare them to FNOT measurements derived from HVSR analysis. We hypothesized that where we found low FNOT values, we would be in either site class D or E, and anywhere with high FNOT values, we would be in shallow, less than 30-meter deposits, and therefore likely A, B, or C site classifications. In the plot on the left, there are mostly white and gray points in areas of till, or high frequency, where geologists have classified the area as site class B. Where there are areas of site classes D or E, there tend to be red and orange points, or low frequency, but there are also some gray points and white points. In the box and whisker plot, we see that frequency tends to drop with an increase in site class, except for site class E, which we'll look at more closely when we discuss subregions. We'll now discuss the subregions in detail, starting with the Boston Basin. In the basin, the frequencies tend to match up well with the site classifications, low in site class E and higher in other classes. Though much of the basin is amplifiable and deep, its amplifiable characteristics are topographically dependent. That is, where there are hills and drumlins, the depth of the overburden decreases, the frequency increases, and thus the site class decreases. The Connecticut River Valley subregion contains fluvial deposits and glaciolacustrine deposits. The majority of the Connecticut River Valley land area is site class E and D, both with predominantly low frequency stations. The Connecticut River Valley amplification is controlled mostly by the river. The closer one gets to the river, the deeper the sediments and the higher the site classification. We expect that with more coverage on the edge of the valley, much of the site class E area could drop to B or C as the depth decreases below 30 meters. Cape Cod is almost entirely classified as site class D by both the geology and slope-based classification models. We agree with this assessment and found the area to be the easiest to understand, as there are no hard rock outcrops and little elevation change. Thus, the only significantly varying amplifiable property in the subregion is depth, tending to increase, that is, a frequency decrease along the length of the Cape. This region has the lowest frequencies of any region we discuss in this presentation. The Champlain sea sediments are another glacial-marine deposit similar in geologic origin to the Boston Blue Clay and the Presumpscot Formation. A significant portion, more than half of the region, is classified as site class E. Like with the Connecticut River Valley, we expect these classifications could decrease as one moves inland and the sediment depth decreases. The frequencies tend to decrease as one drops towards the lake. Much of this area is likely continuously deep and amplifiable. As one moves out of the deeper portions of the old lake, the response likely becomes more variable with bedrock outcrop locations increasing. Shown on the bottom right are two HVSR curves deeper in the lake. The last subregion we present in this study is the Maine coast, where deposits of the Presumpscot Formation are found. This subregion has a significant area of site class E, yet the frequencies we found tend to be higher than frequencies in the other subregions in that same site class. We attribute this to the variability of the depth of the Presumpscot Formation. This region requires much higher resolution depth mapping and reclassifying beyond the geologic classifications to find the pockets where the Presumpscot Formation is deep and clearly site class E versus where it is weathered and shallow, exhibiting behavior of a site class B, C, or D. On to the discussion. The Boston Basin is the smallest and most highly sampled subregion we looked at, with areas of deep sediments well characterized by geology and fundamental frequency. The region also has high population density and high proportion of Class E soils. The Connecticut River Valley contains significant areas of geologically mapped soft Class D and E sediments with relatively low fundamental frequencies. We think that geology does a good job with the site classification, but some of the Class E area can be downgraded where the soil gets shallow, project requiring more F0 or depth to bedrock measurements. Cape Cod is uniform over its entire area, fairly uniform, with variability largely determined by the depth to the impedance contrast, not changes in soil properties. Both geology-based and slope-based site classes are reasonable in the region, site class D over the entire extent. The Presumpscot Formation is variable, with many shallow sections underlain by the rocky Maine coast. It is therefore a hard region to generalize. There are places where the clay is deep and an E site class is justified, but much of the region is highly variable. Higher resolution F0 sampling or geologic mapping is recommended to classify this region. We don't have enough data to verify frequencies within the Champlain sea sediments, but suspect that the geologic classification adjacent to Lake Champlain is justified, but further inland where the depth decreases, the site class should decrease with it. And finally, to conclude, the slope-based site classification map captures regions in New England that exhibit site amplification, but is less conservative than the state geologists' geology-based classifications. We find it useful, therefore, to make the region-specific models for these high-risk regions using the geology-based classifications and including site-specific data. Most of the geology-based site classifications are correlated with fundamental frequency derived from HVSR analysis, an easy measurement technique for collecting many points quickly, but some, such as the Maine coast subregion, are more complex and detailed than the geologic maps show, justifying reclassification. We recommend more data collection in the subregions of high risk to supplement the geology-based classification and to incorporate geomorphologic predictors into the regional model to improve the geologic classification. A unified high-resolution superficial geology map of the region will be valuable for future regional site response studies as well. Thank you, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.